So these are the three new components that form the Azure platform. We have Windows Azure itself, SQL Azure, which is what we're focusing on today, and .NET services. And they're all up in the cloud. And what they do is they complement the more traditional platform. So today, when we talk about code and data and where do they reside, typically we have a range of options from mobile netbooks, desktops, through to servers. And the different trade-offs between these very much depend on the nature of the applications. And the goal here with the Azure platform is to basically extend the range of choices. So we could pick up the database component and move it up to the cloud. Or we could pick up some of the computational processing and move it up here into the cloud. And we can take some of the infrastructure that glues all this together and move it up into the cloud. Now, one of the really nice things about this from an architecture viewpoint is it's not an all or nothing. We can choose the right components that are right for the right situation. So you can have desktop calling up SQL Azure, we can have people coming in off the web and making it through to the desktop. Any mixture that makes sense. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on SQL Azure and work out when would you use it, why would you use it, and what things do you need to be aware of. So you can see that in theory you can just pick up some of this data and move it up to SQL Azure. So Keith, does that mean SQL Azure is just SQL Server up in the clouds in the database environment somewhere?
Well, in fact, to a large extent it is. It grew out of SQL Data Services, which a lot of people have seen already. And although SQL Data Service is quite an interesting idea, the feedback we got from a lot of customers who tried it was they wanted something that was much more familiar, much closer to SQL Server. And to some extent, that is what SQL Azure is, with a few exceptions that we'll talk about later. So the question is, well, why would you actually look at SQL Azure? Why not just deploy SQL Server? Well, everybody will have their own view of that. For me, it's all about management and availability. So if you think about what you have to do with any database, you have to provision a machine, you have to install a database, you have to set up all the daily management tasks, you need to know how to back up, how to restore the database.
And devs are not good at this sort of stuff.
Absolutely. No. And even more importantly, how many people set up a highly available system? Now you need two machines, now you need to know how to replicate in some generic way, either mirror the databases or use replication to get that high availability. And how do you fail over? So SQL Azure gives you all that out of the box, as it were.
So got the PC here, and the question is, if you're interested in SQL Azure, what do you actually have to do? So it's a couple of steps you need to go through before you can get your account up and going. So Keith and I have done this already a couple of times. First thing you need to do is go to azure.net, this is the main site for all information, and follow the link to actually sign up for Azure services. You then get taken to Connect, which you fill in all the information. If you've been to Connect before, a lot of that information will already be there in place. And you do that and you actually apply for the token. It takes typically at the moment, I think, a couple of days for that to be processed, and you'll get an email back from SDS Talk that gives you the actual token and the URL, which is sqlazure.com. You log on to that site, enter the token, and you're in the portal, and this is the point at which you can start actually experimenting with SQL Azure.
So we've jumped over to SQL Server Management Studio, and this is a typical screen you would see straight away, which prompts you to log in. So we need to cancel out of that because we can only connect at the moment to SQL Azure from an actual query rather than directly to and use Object Explorer. So here you can see the server name, and the server name is the long string that you'll be provided with from the portal, and we need to use SQL Server authentication. The other thing I need to do is I need to say specifically which database I want to connect to, and in this case I want to connect to the pubs database. So we can click on connect and we come in, we get a very simple error message saying we don't allow ANSI nulls, but we can ignore that. So some very simple queries that just to prove that it's quite straightforward. We can do standard select from authors, get the data back, a select from title authors, get the data back, or we can do a complicated three-table join and again get the data back. And again, just to prove the point, we'll run one of the standard pubs stored procedures, and again the data comes back. So all very transparent just the same as you would have seen in the sample pubs database a couple of years ago running normal SQL Server.
Wow, so from that work there, it looked like it's just SQL up in the clouds. It looks identical. So are there any differences? Are there things that people who are designing and building applications need to be aware of if they're going to pick up their data and put it up into the clouds with SQL Azure?
So the majority of it is just SQL, but there are some differences.
Okay.
So the first thing you need to be aware of is the fact that we have built quite a sophisticated infrastructure behind the scenes. We are keeping 3 versions of your database. We are synchronizing. We will fire up another one if one of the servers goes down. We'll transfer the data, etc. There's a lot happening behind the scenes that the user's not aware of to give that high availability, and that puts some constraints on the system. So, for example, your 2 or 3 or 4 databases may not be on the same physical machine. That means you can't refer to another database within one database. You can't do things like linked servers because we can't guarantee exactly where that database is at one time.
So you've got to be in the mindset of focusing on
One
a database at a time.
But to be fair, most systems today do exactly that. There's only a few small percentage that will do things like link to another database. So that's not too constraining. There's a few other things. So things like you must have a clustered index on every single table.
Now that's not usual, is it?
That's not usual, but that's a requirement for some of the things we're doing in the back end to implement this infrastructure. So that's a small change you might need to make. As I say, in the previous clip we showed pubs. So that was the example. I took what is a very familiar and a very old database.
Nostalgic
Database, legacy database, and pushed that up. And there's some great documentation that does the same thing for AdventureWorks. And what I found as I moved up the pubs, I had to make a couple of decisions. I had to get rid of the user-defined data types and redefine exactly that the fields were varchar x, etc.
Okay.
I had to move text and image and replace those with varchar max, which is the new way of doing blob data types.
So, because we have talked about this before, about moving these forward,
We've talked for a number of versions of SQL about getting rid of them eventually. And we had and that's pretty much it actually, thinking about it. But there were a few other things that I discovered doing some work. So we don't support the CLR yet in this release.
But we will in a future release. Is
That's
that right?
the plan.
Yeah.
We don't support the geometry data type, but we do support things like the new date and time data types and things like that. So the majority of things are supported, and explaining it this way sounds very negative, but you have to caveat against all the positives. And in fact, the fact is that it really took me a couple of minutes of work to make some alterations to pubs, and it was up there, all the data was there, all the stored procedures ran.
In a highly available, scalable, all of that.
But now I got something that was a machine to fail, I would still transparently have access to my data. It would all be backed up for me, etc. So far more positives than the few minutes it took for me to adjust the database to get it to work.
And now, we've been talking so far about the core SQL Server, but of course SQL Server contains a lot of other stuff as well. How are those going to be migrated forward?
So probably the key thing to think about is things like SQL Server integration services, so being able to bulk move data up into the cloud, and that already works. So we can move data backwards and forwards. We can have SQL Azure as a source or a target for our ETL to move data backwards and forwards. So it is basically just a connection string in ADO.NET or an OLEDB connection string to the data. And so your applications within Reason and all the utilities we've seen that Management Studio pretty much just works. And the one bit that doesn't work, which is the Object Explorer, actually that's because it's trying to find all the databases on the server. It sort of makes sense.
That's why it can't do it, yeah.
And even that, the chances are that once we have time to release a version in the future, we'll overcome that inherent assumption. So a pretty transparent-ish being possibly the operative word, implementation of SQL Server.